Barb read those words from Luke chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census would be taken of the entire Roman world, which was very extensive at that point in history. And so Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the town of Bethlehem. Now, when Luke tells us that Caesar Augustus ordered a census, he's reminding the readers that the Holy Land was occupied territory and that the Hebrew people were no longer free. Much like when they were slaves in Egypt, and yet they had now in Palestine their own territory, but they were still under the regime of a very brutal dictator. They were basically prisoners in their own land. There were Roman troops stationed in large numbers throughout the nation in order to keep the people, the occupied people, those occupied places, under control. But they were also there to ensure that the cash flow of the tax revenues that would come from Palestine would also go back to support the lavish lifestyle of the Roman elite, as well as their ambitious endeavors to continue to take over new conquered peoples. Now, Palestine was considered by the Romans to be one of the most backwater places in the territory. And certainly, poor peasants like Mary and Joseph were of no consideration at all to Caesar Augustus. And so the census was decreed, which meant that every able-bodied man needed to go from, if they weren't in their hometowns of birth, they needed to go back to their hometowns of birth in order to register their names, be counted, and then taxed. That's what it was all about. And so it was in the 9th month of her pregnancy, Mary and Joseph find out that they have to go on this 10-day journey down to Bethlehem. That was Joseph's home village. Now, the emperor doesn't care whether you're sick, whether you're disabled, whether you're pregnant. The decree goes out, and every person is required by law and penalty of, we expect, some kind of brutality to get back to their home places of birth. Now, in our time, when a woman finds out she's pregnant, she typically chooses, the right obstetrician. And if, they have a home or an apartment, they're kind of working at making sure that everything is ready for that imminent birth and the arrival of a new baby. Now, in Mary and Joseph's day, I'm sure they'd be doing all they could to prepare for a newborn in that time and place. But of course, Mary and Joseph's plans for this baby are turned upside down after Caesar Augustus issues that decree. Mary will be in Bethlehem when the baby is due, and she won't have a midwife there to help her through the birth process. This couple won't be surrounded by familiar people. They won't be surrounded by the familiar things in their small little home back in Nazareth. This couple won't have anything familiar. Everything is upside down because of this decree. Now, some of you know from experience that pregnancies can be complicated and uncomfortable, which is the case for Connie when she was delivering our last child, Kelsey. Around 8 months into the pregnancy, Connie discovered that she had kidney stones, which only added to her pain. If you can imagine having kidney stones, well, most of us men can't imagine that at all. But if you can imagine having kidney stones and being 8 months pregnant and then having to deliver a child in the midst of all of that pain, well, you have some idea how anxious Connie would be and how uncomfortable she was. And so if Prime Minister Mulroney, who happened to be the Prime Minister at that time, had issued a decree that Connie had to go down to Vancouver from our little hometown of Lillooet to have this baby, and it would take 10 days journey, war would have broken out, I guarantee you. Now, what do you think Mary was praying on that journey that she really never wanted to take? Perhaps Mary prayed something like, God, you came and you asked me to bear this holy child, and I took on that assignment. I took on the shame of being pregnant outside of marriage. But why couldn't the baby have been born before the trip? Couldn't you have delayed that old emperor's edict by just a few more weeks and everything would have just been fine? Couldn't you just step down into my world and make this easier for me? wouldn't doubt that some of those thoughts were part of Mary's process as she was spending all those days on that long trip down to Bethlehem. Regardless of her prayers, regardless of her thoughts, Mary had to suffer the discomfort and pain on that long journey to Bethlehem. I think we'd all agree that this must have been a journey that she really never wanted to take. You know, all of us at different points in our lives are forced to go on journeys we never want to take. And let's be honest, none of us wanted to go through this past 18 months of the pandemic. Isn't that true? It has brought with it so much confusion, discord, divided people up in homes and in communities all across our land and probably around the world. It's created discomfort for so many people, and it's caused tragedy for all those millions of people who lost a loved one through COVID-19. And perhaps on top of the pandemic, your journey this past year included a funeral for someone you loved. Maybe it was a journey to the doctor's office to hear some really bad news. Maybe it was a journey into the ranks of the unemployed because you got laid off. Could have been the journey to single life after a marriage or relationship dissolved. Or a journey with a son or daughter or another family member who was heading down a path of self-destruction. And there wasn't anything that you could do about it. You see, the truth is, all of us will take journeys down those types of roads at different points in our lives. And they are never easy journeys to take. We are always reluctant travelers to take those kind of journeys in our lives. Now, God didn't make Mary and Joseph take that journey. It really was the emperor who issued the decree because he needed more money. And despite the challenges and pain this couple encountered, do you think that God ever once abandoned Mary and Joseph? Do you think they were ever on their own on that journey? Just as Mary reminded in that psalm that she rewrote to express her own personal journey of having that heart attack and the serious nature of which it was, and yet God was with her and with David and their family throughout that entire unexpected journey. God was with Mary and Joseph every step of the way, even though they never saw God's physical presence with them. And God was working behind the scenes long before Caesar Augustus issued the decree. Think about when the Magi left that eastern part of the empire, following that one bright star on their trek to find the Holy Child. All of that had to be lined up millions of years in advance, right? For the star to be in the right conjunction, for Saturn to be in the right place, for those Magi to look up to that night sky and recognize that there was something going on in the heavens above that reflected God's work on the world that they inhabited. And so they set out on that journey, not because Caesar Augustus ordered it, but because God had orchestrated many things in the heavens millions of years before, so they would recognize it and go and worship the Christ child. Think of all the ancient prophecies in the Old Testament that gave clues, foreshadowed the birth of the Messiah hundreds of years before it would ever happen. Do you see how God was in fact a part of that uncomfortable journey that Mary and Joseph took down to Bethlehem? Mary couldn't see far ahead to the time when all of the world, the story of her arduous journey would be retold, and where she would inspire so many, I think, young women going through maybe similar circumstances, unplanned pregnancies, any number of troubles or challenges, and she would inspire them to just stay the course because Mary had gone through such difficulty in her pregnancy and birth, and even in her lifetime as the mother of Jesus. Mary couldn't see how Jesus would save all humanity. All she could see was a journey she didn't want to take. But God took every part of the journey of Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus and redeemed it and used it for something wonderful that started a movement that would change the world. And here we are 2,000 years later, still retelling the story, still on a journey of faith with God in our presence, in our midst, walking with us down those journeys, whether they're good or bad. Jesus is always with us. You see, God doesn't always keep us from the bad things that happen in life. God doesn't keep us from taking the difficult journeys in life. God's people have had to do that time immemorial. Mary and Joseph are but two examples of many people in the Bible who God calls upon to take very, very difficult journeys. They're all reluctant travelers, like Mary and Joseph in some ways. But what God promises us is to walk with us on these journeys and to even bring something good out of the challenges and pain and suffering. God even promises to use our tears and suffering in order to produce something redemptive as we trust God with all the good and bad parts of life's journeys. The truth is, every tear God sees, every sorrow God redeems. Out of darkness comes light. Out of death comes resurrection. We have to hold together the paradox of suffering alongside of the goodness and love of God. And sometimes I know when you're in the middle of that suffering journey, it is hard to see and experience the love and presence of Jesus. But as you heard in Marion's story of the 23rd Psalm, when she opened her life in the midst of that experience that was very difficult, God met her there and she saw God's hand all throughout the process. God's presence in the doctors and nurses and medical team. God's presence that they happened to be right in Bethlehem at the time that she needed the hospital right there, if you think about it. You see how God can redeem those journeys of pain and suffering, even through this pandemic year, even through the worst things in our life. When we allow and invite God into the journey, God is willing to go with us and to bring peace, love, joy, and hope in the midst of pain and suffering and grief. Psalm 30, verse 5b, one of my favorite psalms, has this verse: tears may last for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Mary and Joseph might have been reluctant travelers on the lonely journey down to Bethlehem prior to the birth of Jesus. But God was with them every step of the way. And when Jesus was born, their sadness and discomfort from the journey melted away in the afterglow of that holy birth. Now, I don't know what challenges you might be facing today, but I'm almost certain that you've come through or still in the midst of a painful, challenging part of the journey of your life. And today we want to provide some space for you to express some of your loss and pain from this past year through a brief liturgy of lighting a candle and saying a prayer. So for those of you folks online, I hope you have a candle close by that you might be able to light through this part of the service. For those folks in our church, I'm going to invite you at the end of this little liturgy just to come forward and to light a candle. And we have many of them here, and you can say your own prayer. And it will be a symbolic act of allowing God to enter with you into the journey of your pain or suffering or grief or loss, and to light that candle as a symbol of hope that Jesus is always with you, even through the most difficult times. And so this is the point in the service where we're going to go into this moment of kind of holy peace and remembering. And it will then be followed by communion. We'll sing a song as we move out of this. So Nancy, in a few minutes' time, I'm going to invite you to come forward, and we will go to sing that song as people come forward to light their candles. And we're going to go from the front to the back. So don't clog up the center aisle. When there's some space, just come forward, light a candle. Connie will be at the front. She'll give you the communion elements. You can take those back with you, and then we'll have communion after this. So why don't we enter into a time of prayer, get this, and remembrance. I have 3 candles here that I'm going to light for each time of remembrance. The first candle we light is to remember those whom we have lost through this past year and a bit. We pause to remember their names, their faces, their voices, and the memories that bind us to them in this season. So just close your eyes and remember that person or persons who you lost over the last year and a bit. Remember their families as well, who feel more closely the pain of that loss. O God, surround those we have loved and lost with your eternal love. Amen. The second candle we light is to redeem the pain of loss, the loss of relationships, the loss of jobs, the loss of health, perhaps, or memory. We pause to gather up the pain of the past and offer those things to God. And so again, in an attitude of prayer, just remember those losses before God. The loss of not seeing family members for a long time. The loss of not being with a friend and going through a really challenging time because they've been a distance away. The loss of relationships, broken amidst the brokenness and fragility of our society through the pandemic. Other losses that you experienced this past year and a half. The loss of health. God, refresh, restore, and renew us. Lead us into your good future. Amen. The third candle we light is to remember ourselves in this Advent season. We pause and remember the months of discomfort, isolation, times of depression. We pause to give thanks for those who comforted us, who stood with us and brought hope and peace to our lives when it seemed like life was so difficult. And now your own prayers. To give thanks for those who comforted you, helped you, encouraged you, as well as the encouragement and hope that God gave you in that journey this past year and a half. God, we remember your promise that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will never extinguish it. Amen. I'm going to invite Nancy to come forward. We're going to put on the screen a song of great faith and encouragement during very, very difficult times. I'm going to invite Connie to come forward. She's going to have the communion elements. They're in a little container. There's a grape and a cracker. for those of us who are participating in communion,